Hello, this is Professor Broker, and this is your Chapter 15, Lecture 2 for Econ 231 titled Monopolies Part 2. Let's get started. So remember, there were three sources of barriers to entry for monopolies, of why monopolies arise, right? There was the government-created monopoly, right? Then there was a firm could be the single owner of a key resource. Then some markets just generate natural monopolies because it makes the most economic sense. Okay, and there were specific categories. Remember that for the government creative monopolies, patent law and copyright law was a good example of that. De Beers Diamonds was a good example of the firm that owns a key resource. And then natural monopolies were like your local municipalities, your local utilities, electricity, and water provision and things like that. Okay, remember this was our profit. This was our basic graph for the monopoly, right? We have an upward sloping marginal cost curve. We had a downward sloping market demand curve. And remember, marginal revenue is less than price. So it's going to be less than our demand or below our demand curve, right? And our profit maximizing monopolist will equate marginal revenue and marginal cost to determine their quantity. Then they will set price according to what consumers are willing to pay, which is going to be according to the demand curve up here. Okay? And then if we had a average total cost curve, of course, then we would take this point either up or down on this plane to average total cost, and then that would help us determine our profit or our loss. Okay? Now remember, also one of the key characteristics of a monopolist is that their output is less than what the competitive output would be, which would be over here, and the price is higher than what the competitive price would be, which would be right here. So the monopolist produces less and charges a higher price, which is what generates a dead weight loss, as you'll remember. Now I want to apply these concepts to a little bit of a mathematical example. Okay, imagine I give you a demand curve, right, which is price equals 1,000 minus 10Q. Okay, obviously that would be a negative relationship between price and quantity. Okay, the slope there would be negative 10. The y-intercept would be 1,000. Okay, so that would be our linear demand curve. Then if I gave you our total cost curve, 100Q plus 5Q squared. Okay, so that would be our monopolist's total cost. Our marginal revenue, okay, I'm just giving this to you, but it could be derived by simply multiplying this price function times quantity, and then that would give us our total revenue, and then taking the first derivative. Okay, so you can work through that on your own if you want to, or you can just take it as a given here, 1,000 minus 20Q. Notice that our marginal revenue is the same intercept as our demand curve, but twice the slope, negative 20 as opposed to negative 10 slope. Okay, that's, if you'll remember, that's what I said, that when we have a linear demand curve, our marginal revenue will always have the same intercept and twice the slope. Okay, and then our marginal cost function is simply going to be the first derivative of this total cost function, right? So you can think about the first derivative there, and here we have our marginal cost function. It's going to be an upward sloping linear function. Okay, so these are our functions. These are our curves that we're going to use. We want to find the price and quantity that maximizes the monopolist profits. We want to find the price and quantity that it would be the competitive equilibrium. Okay, and then we want to calculate the dead weight loss. And we're going to do this graphically as well as mathematically. Okay. Now, this is me graphing our demand function, right? So if we take that function, 1,000 minus 10Q, notice the intercept is 1,000, and then minus 10Q, right, would be our negative 10 slope, and so each of these points, right, would be along that curve, down 100 over 10, down 100 over 10. That would be our negative 10 slope, and that would be our demand curve. Our marginal revenue function would be the same intercept, but again twice the slope. So down 100 over 200 over 10, down 200 over 10. Okay, and then that would be our marginal revenue curve. I'm simply plotting points and the functions graphically that were mathematically appeared on the previous slide. Okay, and then our marginal cost function was 100 plus 10Q, so we start at 100, and then we simply go up 100 and over 10, up 100 over 10, and so on and so forth, and we get our marginal cost function. Okay, and so this is graphically, we've graphed the functions from the previous page. Okay, and this looks like our basic monopolist graph that we were typically, that we saw before, right? We have an upward sloping marginal cost curve, a downward sloping demand curve, and a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. Now, we want to find the price and quantity that maximizes the monopolist's profits. Let's go back to the graph. Where would it be, right? Well, again, they're going to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, which is where this red line intersects the yellow line. Okay, so at this quantity, it looks like 30. That quantity would maximize our monopolist's profits, and then of course they would take the price up to the demand curve, which looks like 700. Okay, so graphically, that's easy to find. How would we do it mathematically? We would again set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. That was 1,000 minus 20Q is our marginal revenue. Equals, we set that equal to 100 plus 10Q, and find the quantity that sets those that satisfies this set, and it would simply be 30. Okay, so again, if you take 20. If we solve this, take 20 to that side, we get 30Q. Subtract 100, we get 900 equals 30Q. Divide both sides by 30, and you get Q star equals 30, which is what we saw previously. Now, how do I find the price that the monopolist would charge? I simply plug that 30 into the demand function, okay, and I get 1,000 minus 10 times 30, or 1,000 minus 300, which is $700. So again, the monopolist would produce 30 units, and they would charge $700 per unit. This is exactly what we said would happen on the previous slide graphically. Okay, so there it is, profit maximizing level of quantity for the monopolist, and then the profit maximizing price is 700. Okay. Now, what about the price quantity that would maximize social welfare? That would be the competitive equilibrium, which would be where this marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve right there. Okay, so graphically, you can see that it's probably about 45 units, and between 500 and 600, probably $550, right? So the competitive price would be lower at 550, and the competitive quantity would be higher at 45 units. Let's see if that bears out mathematically, right? So again, it looks like we would just set the marginal cost curve, which would serve as our supply curve, equal to the demand curve. So price equals marginal cost. Okay, remember our demand curve was 1,000 minus 10Q. Our marginal cost function was 100 plus 10Q. We set those equal. We solve for Q. Take 10 to the other side. Okay, take this 10 over here. That'd be 20Q. Take this over here. Subtract it. That would be 900. 900 equals 20Q. Okay, divide by 20, you get 45. Okay, and so Q star, again, that's exactly what we said from the previous graph. We plug that into the price function. 1,000 minus 10 times 45, or 450, would be $550, which is exactly what we said on the here graphically, right? That's where the two curves intersect, and then that would be our price. So that would be the competitive outcome. Now, what about deadweight loss? Okay, well, graphically, where would it be? It would be this triangle right here. It would be the difference between price and marginal cost, where the monopolist produces, and then it would be the difference between this point, where this quantity the monopolist produces, and the quantity that the competitive outcome would achieve, right? So it would be this triangle right here. All of these transactions that now don't take place if a monopoly produces, where the demand curve is above the marginal cost curve, or in other words, where the buyers value the product more than the cost of production, yet these transactions don't take place because the monopolist restricts output. Okay, so we need to find the area of this triangle, in other words, which is base times height divided by 2. What would be the base? The base would be the difference between this price of 700 and the value of where marginal cost, where marginal cost and marginal revenue equal, which looks like it would be about 400. So that distance right there, 700 minus 400, times this distance right here, which would be the height, which would be the difference between 45 and 30, or 15, divided by 2. And then that would be the area of the deadweight loss. So it would be 45 minus 30, the height, okay, which would be 15, times 700 minus 400. Okay, and again, we got that by plugging in the quantity to either the marginal cost or marginal revenue function. Okay, and then we divide that by 2, base times height divided by 2, and that should equal 2,250, which would represent this triangle right there. That would be our deadweight loss. That's how much value is destroyed, okay, $2,250, if this market is dominated by a monopoly as opposed to being competitively provided. Now, so monopolists create deadweight loss. They charge prices higher to consumers than a competitive market would. So, clearly for consumers' sake and for efficiency's sake, it might be better in most markets for maybe potentially for the government to get involved to try to encourage more competition, because competition helps consumers. What are some ways they can do that? Well, the government can try to increase competition with antitrust laws. So there were some laws passed specifically back at the turn of the 20th century, right around that time. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the Clayton Act of 1914. These acts are still in use today and litigated to try to keep markets more competitive. And so, for example, when AT&T wants to buy a smaller cell phone carrier, or when various healthcare companies try to merge together, they will typically have to go through the regulatory apparatus of the federal government that specifically centers around the Clayton Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act. And basically, the government has to decide, when these mergers happen, are they going to be creating a lot less competition, too much? Basically, are they going to destroy so much competition that consumers are going to be adversely affected, or will there still be enough competition in order to help consumers? And that's the government's one of their main actions that they can do with monopolies. And sometimes they come back and they say, yeah, if AT&T buys this smaller company, there will only be maybe 3 or 4 providers as opposed to 5 or 6, and 3 or 4 would create a situation where the firms have too much market power, too much pricing power, and consumers would be hurt. So that's one way they can do it. There's a nice discussion at this link about dentists and how sometimes some states have more competition than others, and how more competitive dental markets in states actually help to lower prices. Okay, then the government can affect public policy towards monopolies through regulation. And so government agencies can actually set the price that monopolist charges. This is most often done through the electricity markets and utility markets. Utilities are heavily regulated by usually state governments, but also sometimes federal regulations. But the electricity company we talked about is probably a natural monopoly, and so it's going to be just one firm most likely. Same thing with local water companies and so on. And so the government rightly recognizes that should be a monopoly. It would be wrong to try to create 3 or 4 different electricity companies for a city, because that would just be a waste of resources. But what they can do is they can step in and say, look, you can't gouge consumers who need electricity. We will heavily regulate you to prevent you from making, basically setting prices well above what consumers can pay. And so that's one way. That's one thing they can do. Okay. Another option is public ownership. This happens, for example, like in Murray, the local government owns and runs the natural gas and water provider. That is a public provision of a natural monopoly. So they might not choose to regulate it. They might choose to just provide it in itself. Kind of an old school example would be the U.S. Postal Service. I would argue the U.S. Postal Service has more competition today. It's not a perfect monopoly, mainly because, obviously FedEx and UPS compete on packages, but then also I would say that email and technological advances like email and texting even and some other things have created a lot more competition for the U.S. Postal Service, which is actually, again, it's good for consumers, but you can also think about how competition is hard on producers, and the U.S. Postal Service has struggled as of, the last few years, and I would argue primarily because of the increase of competition through technological advances. Okay. And one of the downsides of public ownership is that it can tend to be less efficient. You see this specifically not only in the United States, but also government-run, agencies and things, and government-run businesses in other countries, specifically maybe more command-oriented countries around the world. And those tend to be a little bit less efficient run apparatuses, because if it's a state enterprise, there's not necessarily a profit motive, and therefore there's less incentive to try to minimize costs. Therefore, costs can balloon, and they can be covered sort of by the tax base and through general revenue from the government with no real accountability. And so it can be a little bit less efficient, which is one downside. Okay? And then one other response is to do nothing. The government can sometimes come in and say, you know what, we recognize this is a monopoly and we're not going to do a thing. Now, you might think to yourself, why would the government not do anything about a monopoly? There's a real good reason. It's an economic reason, right? So monopolies create a cost, okay, a deadweight loss that we can measure, and consumers pay a higher price. But also the government trying to fix the monopoly also has costs, and that sometimes can cost society more than basically just doing nothing. Okay, and so sometimes the government says, you know what, here's a monopoly, and it's not necessarily a perfect utopian scenario. However, it would be too costly to try to basically rein them in, and so we're going to let them exist because we think the cost would be too high to basically come in and try to regulate, or to maybe public ownership or something like that. Now, in the real world, a pure monopoly is very rare, okay? But this analysis that we used in this chapter is applicable to firms with market power, okay? And many firms do have market power in the real world, even though there's not a pure monopoly per se, where they are legitimately the only provider of this. Many firms do sell a unique product or a unique variety of product, and they might have very large market share, which means that they do have sort of, they can throw their elbows around. They do have pricing power. And so this analysis of when these firms have market power, even though they're not a perfect monopoly, if they have some market power, they will still charge a higher price above marginal cost. They will still restrict output, and this will create deadweight losses in the economy. Microsoft would be a good example of that. Apple would be a good example of that, to be honest. AT&T would be a good, and just the cell phone industry in general would be a good example of that. Okay, these would be markets where the firms have significant market power. Now, the last thing I kind of want to talk about is this idea of dynamic pricing. Okay, sometimes monopolists, because they have market power, are able to charge different prices to different consumers. And to illustrate why they would want to do that, let's think about a book example. Let's say a new book's coming out, and a marketing firm determines that there are 100 die-hard fans for this book that are willing to pay. That's what WTP means. They're willing to pay $30 for this book. Okay, that's the most they're willing to pay. They'd obviously be willing to pay less than that. 400 casual fans of the book coming out, however, are only willing to pay $5. They want the book, but the most they're willing to pay is $5. There's fixed cost, we'll say royalty fees of $2,000 to publish the book, but after that, the marginal cost is $0. Okay, just to simplify the problem. So the question is if you can only charge one price, what would be the profit maximizing price that this monopolist should charge? Okay. Well, thinking about it, I just flashed the answer on the screen, but thinking about it, you might think, oh, well, maybe $5, right? Because then we could sell it to more people. But if you sold it for $5, you would sell 500 books, but you would only sell each of them for $5, netting you some revenue of $2,500. Subtracting the $2,000 cost, you would only make $500. What if, however, you charged $30? Okay, you would only sell to the 100 diehard fans, but you would net $3,000 revenue minus the $2,000 cost. You would actually make $1,000 of profit. So the profit maximizing price, right, would actually be $30, and that would neglect, right, 80% of this particular market. But if they're trying to make money, that's what they would do, right? So what if we could charge different prices, right? Then how could that benefit our situation? Well, if we could charge $30 to these fans and make $3,000, then we could charge $5 to these fans, make $2,000. That would be revenue of $5,000 minus the $2,000. We could triple our profits simply by being able to charge different prices to different consumers based on their willingness to pay, how much they valued it. That would obviously be a good thing that we would want to do as a firm, right, to maximize our profits, or as an author, as it were. Okay. The question is could this actually be done in the book market? And the answer is yes. It's done all the time. Books typically come out with a hardcover, okay, right, first, that costs more. Then maybe a few months later, the exact same book will come out in paperback, usually for a cheaper price. The hardback is aimed at the die-hard fans. That's why it's more expensive. The paperback is aimed at the casual fan, which is why it's less expensive. This is a good example of what we call dynamic pricing, the publisher trying to maximize their profits, okay, through charging different prices. Okay. Sometimes this is called price discrimination. Okay. Discrimination is obviously a very negative term, and we're not talking about treating people differently based on some characteristic. We're talking about charging them a different price based on how they value the product. And so people that value it more would pay more. People that value it less would pay less. Okay. And so sometimes it's called dynamic pricing. Sometimes it's called price discrimination. And so don't let that word discrimination totally throw you off there, because it's not exactly like other forms of discrimination that would be viewed with a negative connotation. Now, the characteristic we're talking about here in this case is, again, willingness to pay or value. Okay, and a firm would want to do this because it can increase their profits. Now, a firm would have to do a couple things. They needed to be able to distinguish different consumers' willingness to pay, which is very difficult, right? I mean, most consumers don't wear a sign on their forehead that says, I'm willing to pay twice as much for this product, right? Because consumers want to get the lowest price possible. So a firm would need to be able to distinguish which consumers are willing to pay more than others, okay? And a firm would need to be able to prevent resale. It would do them no good to sell a product for a cheaper price to a consumer who could then just immediately turn around and sell it for a higher price to someone who wants it more, okay? Because that wouldn't benefit the firm at all. And then a firm would need to have market power to be able to charge the different prices, which is why we're talking about this with relation to monopolies. If a firm doesn't have these three things, or they're very sketchy, then a firm would not be able to price discriminate or to have dynamic pricing as much. Okay, and so to the extent that they have these three characteristics present down here, okay, determines to what extent they can charge dynamic prices and what level their profits go up. So graphically, let's think about perfect price discrimination versus a single price monopoly. Let's just look at an example. Here we have a constant marginal cost, okay, to make things simple. And we have a downward sloping demand and downward sloping marginal revenue. The single price monopolist will charge a price, set a quantity here where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. They will charge a price according to the demand curve, okay. The upward triangle, as you learned in chapter 7, okay, will generate consumer surplus, everything below the demand curve but above the price. Okay, this rectangle here would be our producer surplus / monopoly profit. Okay, and again, we can do that because this marginal cost would also be the average total cost because it's constant. That's not always true, but because it's constant, we're simplifying it. And then this triangle here would be our deadweight loss. Okay. Transactions that are beneficial but don't take place because it's a single price monopolist. Now, obviously, the monopolist makes money in this case, but what if they could charge a price, okay, that is equal to every single buyer's willingness to pay? They could perfectly price discriminate, okay? What would happen? Well, that means they would charge, this demand curve represents what every consumer is willing to pay. This is a marginal buyer, this is a marginal buyer, this is a marginal buyer, and this demand curve represents what their willingness to pay. So if we could charge them, every consumer, what they're willing to pay, then which would be called perfect price discrimination, okay, then this entire rectangle here would become profit for the monopoly, okay? Now this is just theoretical. Most firms can't perfectly price discriminate. In fact, I would argue no firm can. But if they could, this entire rectangle, everything above marginal cost and average total cost and everything below demand would become monopoly profit. Now, a couple things. That would obviously really hurt consumers because that would totally eliminate consumer surplus. But it would also eliminate the deadweight loss and it would increase output. So from a technical welfare standpoint, it would actually be beneficial for the market. Now, it would obviously hurt consumers and it would benefit the firm solely, but it would actually be overall more efficient, okay? But it's not very realistic because no firm has perfect price discrimination. It just gives you an idea of why firms would want to price discriminate because it would increase their profits. Right now, in the real world, perfect price discrimination is not possible. And so firms will try to basically distinguish and put buyers into different groups. Okay, so this is why you get senior discounts at restaurants and movie theaters, right? I mean, because they rightly recognize that, senior adults might have, maybe less disposable income. Okay, and so they might be living on less, and so they might have a lower willingness to pay as a group, right? So people maybe 65 and older, 55 and older, they might be willing to pay less as a group, so they give them a discount, right? As opposed to someone in their 30s or 40s who might have more disposable income. That is an example to try to price discriminate. Okay. Some other examples, again, are like movie tickets. You got student discounts. The idea there is that students, again, might have less money than, say, a 30 or 40-year-old, and so they might have a smaller willingness to pay or a lower willingness to pay. Therefore, movie theaters try to capture that by offering them a discount, separating them into groups. Airline prices, right? Oftentimes, as you get closer to your flights that are very popular, popular travel routes between two popular cities, as you get closer to the departure date, oftentimes tickets will go up in price, right? But if you book your ticket for the same flight, the exact same service and good, if you book the same ticket, a month, 2 months, 3 months in advance, oftentimes you can get a much cheaper price. Why is that? That's dynamic pricing. Airlines are masters at dynamic pricing. And again, one thing you might think about is people who plan way ahead are probably families going on vacation. They probably have a smaller willingness to pay, a lower value, right, on that, a lower willingness to pay. Whereas last minute travelers are probably, business travelers, right? There's a meeting that's scheduled Friday to leave Saturday or to leave Monday, right? And so, and so think about business travelers, right? Paying with, being booked by the company probably and so on and so forth. They have to be there, right? So there's more, demand there, as well as a higher willingness to pay. Therefore, airlines typically charge a higher price, right? And so you can sort of think about different groups that way. And that's one way that airlines charge dynamic pricing. Okay? Discount coupons. This is by far my favorite. Kroger is a master at this. Right? Kroger, and there's other companies that are starting to do it, right? But they'll give you personalized coupons, right? Like on the back of your receipts. If you go to Kroger and you get your you get your receipt printed out, there'll be coupons on the back of your receipt that are personalized to you. They'll also email you personalized, okay, not just general coupons, but personalized coupons. And think about it. Kroger knows your data. Why? How do they know it? Because you swipe your Kroger card whenever you go. Any place that has a membership card, like a loyalty card, what they're really doing is trying to track your purchases, okay? Because then they can personalize coupons. So this is what they can do. Maybe they want to charge $5 for a frozen pizza in their store, but they know that you aren't going to buy it unless it's, $4. Well, they don't have to lower the price for everybody to $4. They could keep the price at $5 in the store, and they could send you a personalized coupon for $1 off. Maybe they know someone else who's only willing to buy it at $3 because of their past transaction history, so they send them a $2 off coupon. And then they can sell it to all three consumers and maximize their potential profits. Discount coupons, personalized discount coupons, are a beautiful way to price discriminate and dynamic pricing, and it's a way that these firms are trying to increase their profits. Need-based financial aid is dynamic pricing, right? No, not everybody at college pays the same to be there, right? There's scholarships, there's need-based financial aid, and that's a form of dynamic pricing. Okay, quantity discounts. You buy more. The more you buy in bulk, the cheaper the price you can get. Trying to distinguish, between different willingness to pay. So these are all good examples of dynamic pricing in the real world. But remember, the key here is you have to have market power. Firms have to be able to distinguish different consumers and their different willingness to pays. Okay, and you have to be able to prevent resale reasonably. And when you can do that, these firms can increase their profits through dynamic pricing.